In this lecture, we're going to cover the endocrine system. Now, the two systems that control the body are going to be the endocrine system and the nervous system. I always think of the nervous system as being your wired communication. I think of the endocrine system as being your wireless or Wi-Fi communication. And think about it this way. You have the nerves that go out to control the body. It would be like if, I don't know, maybe I'm having a garage sale and I put out a table. And, I have a bunch of things on the table and maybe a lamp is there. And someone comes up and says, "Hey, does this lamp work?" And I'm like, "Well, just a minute. Let me plug it in." I plug in the lamp, click it, and sure enough, the light comes on. Yes, it works. And they're like, "Great, I'll take it." Well, I'm a little lazy. I don't feel like bending over and unplugging it, so I grab some scissors and I snip the cord in half and hand it to them and say, "Go pay my wife at the end of the driveway." So what's wrong with that issue now? Does that lamp work anymore? Well, I just showed you it worked, but I cut the cord, the communication basically from the outlet, and cut the electricity going to the bulb, and now it doesn't work. Same thing with the nervous system. If we cut any of the cords, in other words, the nerves, going to a particular organ, that organ will not work. Okay? Whereas the endocrine system, it secretes its messengers out into the bloodstream, and it's kind of like a phone. Think about a phone, for instance. Is your phone ringing at this very second? Some of you it might be, but some of you it might not be. Well, there are people all over the world making a phone call, so why is it your phone is not ringing? Well, that's because the signals that are going out, they're not relying on wires, okay? But they are very specialized and very targeted, okay? So if I make a phone call to you, that signal is going to target your cell phone, okay? And so with the endocrine system, we put out these signals, the hormones basically, that go throughout the entire body, but they don't affect every cell. Just like all the cell signals going out right now don't affect every cell phone, just the one it's targeting. So with the endocrine system, we have what are called target cells, and that's what those hormones are going to affect. So let's go back to the slide. So the nervous system and endocrine system act together to coordinate functions of all body systems. The nervous system is going to send nerve impulses. It can also release neurotransmitters. With the nervous system, you typically get a faster response, but the effects are briefer, and it acts on specific targets. The endocrine system, you have hormones. These are mediator molecules that are released in one part of the body, but regulates the activity of cells in another part. You typically have a slower response. The effects usually last longer, and it has broader influence than the nervous system. Good example of that would be like maybe you're, texting someone, not really paying too much attention. You step out into the traffic, and then you realize through your peripheral vision that you're about to get creamed by a car when you jump back on the curve and the car speeds by. So the fact that you possibly heard or saw that car, that's part of the nervous system. When you jumped back out of the way, that's part of the nervous system. Now, when you jumped, that was pretty quick, right? It was kind of reflexive. But you didn't just keep jumping backward, right? So the effect was more brief. But then a few seconds later, after you realize you haven't been creamed, your body's still intact, then all of a sudden you notice your heart racing, your pulse is going up, you might feel a little dizzy, okay? You start shaking all over because you realize you were almost creamed at that point. Okay. So the endocrine system, it took a little bit longer for it to kind of catch up with what's going on. But as soon as you realize you didn't get squished by the car, do you stop shaking? Does your heart slow down right away? No, not right away. It takes a little while. Okay. So the nervous impulse was fast. You jumped out of the way. You saved yourself. The endocrine system took a minute to catch up onto what's going on. The reaction there lasted a bit longer. Now, there's two types of glands in the body. There's endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Exocrine glands have ducts. Endocrine glands don't have ducts. They secrete products into the interstitial fluid and they diffuse into the blood. I think of an endocrine gland as kind of like a sponge where it just oozes those secretions out. Whereas the exocrine gland will have a duct or a tube coming away from it, and whatever its product is, such as saliva or a digestive enzyme or what have you, will be secreted into that duct or that tube, and that carries it to the part of, the mouth or the digestive tract or etc., where that product needs to go. Okay? Now, endocrine glands include the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid gland, the adrenal, and the pineal glands. Now, the hypothalamus, thymus, pancreas, ovaries, testes, kidneys, stomach, liver, small intestine, skin, heart, believe it or not, the heart, adipose tissue, and placenta, they're not exclusively endocrine glands, but they do secrete hormones. Okay, who would have thought that the heart would secrete a hormone, right? The lungs. I don't see lungs on here. The lungs also secrete hormones. So if we look at this picture here, we can see the pituitary gland kind of hanging off a little stalk. If you remember the skull anatomy, the sella turcica, that's where that pituitary gland lives. The hypothalamus is in that area as well, and the hypothalamus basically kind of controls the pituitary gland. We call the pituitary gland the master gland because of all of the hormones it secretes. However, it's really the hypothalamus that's calling the shots. And we also have the pineal gland, which is right at the end of the epithalamus. So here's the thalamus, here would be the epithalamus. Right at the end of that epithalamus, we'd find the pineal gland. Down here we have the thyroid gland. If we look behind the thyroid gland, we see the parathyroid glands. And we go a little farther down. It talked about the thymus, so here's the thymus. Also the heart. We have the adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys. We also have the pancreas, which is two glands for your money. It's endocrine and exocrine. Okay. And then we have the testes in the male and the ovaries in the female. Now, hormones affect only specific target tissues with specific receptors. And the receptors are constantly synthesized and broken down. And so we can have downregulation or upregulation. In other words, if a cell is not getting enough of a certain hormone, maybe that hormone is kind of minimized, it might upregulate and you'll get more of those receptors per cell to try to grab on as much hormone as possible to cause a certain reaction within that cell. Downregulation, if there's too much of that hormone going on, then the cells will downregulate. In other words, it'll start breaking some of those receptors down to try to mitigate some of that that action that overabundance of hormone is causing. Okay. Now, hormone types. We have circulating hormones, and of course, these circulate in the blood throughout the body. We have local hormones, they act locally, and the two types would be paracrine, that act on neighboring cells, and then autocrine, which act on the same cell that secretes them. The chemical classes of hormones, we have lipid soluble hormones, and they use transport proteins. And these would be like steroids, thyroid hormone, and nitric oxide. Water soluble hormones circulate in free form, and these are going to be your amine type hormones, the protein or peptide hormones, and eicosanoids. Now, the response is going to depend on both hormone and target cell. Lipid soluble hormones bind to receptors inside the target cell. Water soluble hormones bind to receptors that are on the plasma membrane, so they don't enter the cell. It's going to activate what's called a second messenger system. We also get amplification of the original small signal. And the responsiveness of target cells depends on hormone concentration, abundance of target cell receptors, and the influence exerted by other hormones. Some other hormones might be permissive, they might be synergistic and work along with that particular hormone, or they might have an antagonistic effect and work against each other. So let's look at lipid soluble and water soluble hormones. In this case, this is a lipid soluble hormone. And as you can see here, it's diffusing into the cell. And then the activated receptor hormone complex alters gene expression. What does that mean? When genes become expressed, that means they get turned on and they start producing something. They might make a protein or what have you. So the newly formed messenger RNA directs synthesis of specific proteins on the ribosome. And the new proteins are going to alter that cell's activity. Looking at the water-soluble hormones, we have binding of the hormone, which is the first messenger, to its receptor, which activates G protein, which then activates adenylate cyclase. And then we have our second messenger, which activated adenylate cyclase converts ATP into cyclic AMP. And the cyclic AMP serves as a second messenger to activate protein kinases. The activated protein kinase helps to phosphorylate cellular proteins. And millions of phosphorylated proteins cause reactions that produce physiological responses within that cell. And then phosphodiesterase inactivates the cyclic AMP. So the control of hormone secretion, it's regulated by signals from the nervous system. Think about a fight or flight response. Okay, if you're in that fight or flight response, some of the hormones that might be released are what we would call adrenaline, but the technical term would be epinephrine. Chemical changes in the blood, such as pH, as an example. And other hormones as well. And most hormonal regulation is by negative feedback. There are a few examples of positive feedback. Negative feedback, if you remember, is when you reach a certain level, then that particular hormone is going to stop being produced until you drop down to a certain level, and then it picks up and starts being produced again. Okay. Whereas a positive feedback, the stimulus is going to build onto another stimulus, which builds onto another stimulus, and so on. So it's a building process. An example of a positive feedback hormone would be like oxytocin. Now, the hypothalamus is a major link between nervous and endocrine systems. The pituitary is attached to the hypothalamus by the infundibulum, which is a little stalk. The anterior pituitary is also known as the adenohypophysis. Adeno means gland. It refers to glands. And if we look at it under the microscope, it's going to look more glandular. The posterior pituitary is known as the neurohypophysis because under the microscope, too, it looks more like nervous tissue. And if you remember the sella turcica, again in the skull, that's where the pituitary sits, that little dished out area is called the hypophyseal fossa. Again, because the hypophysis is kind of an older term for the pituitary gland. But again, anterior pituitary is adenohypophysis, it's more glandular. Posterior pituitary is neurohypophysis because it's more nervous tissue. And here we can see the anterior and the posterior pituitary. Now, the anterior pituitary, we get a release of hormones that's stimulated by releasing and inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus. It's also regulated by negative feedback. Hypothalamic hormones made by neurosecretory cells are transported by the hypophyseal portal system. So let's take a look at that. Right here, this is actually the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. And it sounds like a big word, right? Hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. But if we just break it apart, hypothalamic, that means it starts in the hypothalamus. Hypophyseal, which means it goes to the pituitary gland. And it's a portal system. Sometimes when I'm driving to certain campuses, I drive over bridges and below are canals. That is a portal system. Okay, so we have barges with products on it that are floating down these canals. That's pretty much what we have here. We have these series or network of capillaries that acts as a portal system, transporting things from the hypothalamus down to the hypophysis. So that's why we call it the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. Okay? And then the anterior pituitary hormones that act on the endocrine system are called tropic hormones. So let's look at some of those hormones. We have the human growth hormone, or HGH. It's also called somatostatin. Stimulates secretion of insulin-like growth factors, or IGFs, and that promotes growth and also protein synthesis. Now, thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH, it's also called thyrotropin. It stimulates the synthesis and secretion of thyroid hormone in the thyroid. And if the doctor suspects you might have some thyroid issues, they'll run panels looking at the thyroid hormone, and that would be your T3 and your T4. We'll talk about what that is later. But they'll also look at TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, because it might not be a problem with your thyroid at all. It might be a problem with the pituitary gland. And then we have FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone. In the ovaries, it initiates development of the oocytes, or the eggs. And in the testes, it's going to stimulate sperm maturation. Okay? So again, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. It stimulates the follicles in the ovary to produce an egg. What's the analogous structure to the egg, but in the male? That would be the sperm. So FSH stimulates sperm maturation. Okay. Then we have LH, or luteinizing hormone. In the ovaries, it stimulates ovulation. In the testes, it stimulates testosterone production. Then we have prolactin that promotes milk secretion by the mammary glands. Then we have ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, or corticotropin. It stimulates glucocorticoid secretion by the adrenal glands. And then we have MSH, which is melanocyte stimulating hormone. In humans, we have no idea what it does. The effects of HGH and IGFs. Now, this is going to help regulate blood sugar. You might think because you're not growing anymore, that you don't utilize growth hormone, human growth hormone, but that's not true. We're constantly secreting human growth hormone to regulate our blood sugar levels. So with a low blood glucose level, hypoglycemia, it's going to stimulate the release of GHRH, which is growth hormone release hormone from the hypothalamus. So this growth hormone release hormone, or GHRH, stimulates secretion of human growth hormone by the somatotrophs. And when you see that somatotrophs, that means the cells that produce the human growth hormone. Okay. Now the HGH and the IGFs, IGF stands for insulin-like growth factor, that speeds up breakdown of liver glycogen into glucose, which enters the blood more rapidly. So we have low blood sugar. We're not ingesting more sugar. Okay. So one of the quick ways to get sugar so that we can raise our blood sugar levels is to take the stored up glycogen in the liver, break it down quickly into glucose to raise that blood sugar. Okay. Does that make sense? And so again, in a response to that hypoglycemia, the GHRH is sent down through the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system into the anterior pituitary, okay? That stimulates human growth hormone, and then also the IGFs to tell the liver basically to take that glycogen, break it down into glucose. Now blood glucose level rises to normal, which is about 90 milligrams per 100 milliliters. If blood glucose continues to increase, hyperglycemia inhibits the release of the growth hormone releasing hormone. Okay, so we're looking at a negative feedback. With high blood glucose, hyperglycemia, it's going to stimulate the release of growth hormone inhibiting hormone, or GHIH. And so that growth hormone inhibiting hormone inhibits the secretion of human growth hormone by somatotrophs, again, by those cells that produce the HGH. And then a low level of HGH and IGFs decreases the rate of glycogen breakdown in the liver, and the glucose enters the blood more slowly. And if blood glucose levels falls below about 90 milligrams per 100 milliliters, if the blood glucose continues to decrease, hypoglycemia inhibits the release of GHIH. So again, negative feedback. The posterior pituitary does not synthesize hormones. It stores and releases hormones made by the hypothalamus. And these hormones are going to be transported along the hypothalamohypophyseal tracts. Instead of the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, it'll be the hypothalamic hypophyseal tracts. And the two hormones that the posterior pituitary actually stores, again, it's being made by the hypothalamus, are going to be oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. So, of all the hormones that are produced by the pituitary, if you just remember, if you have to memorize any of them, memorize the posterior pituitary secretes oxytocin and ADH. If it's not oxytocin or ADH, but it's a pituitary hormone, it's going to be coming from the anterior pituitary. Okay, so a little test question help right there. Memorize posterior pituitary, oxytocin, and antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. Again, if it's a pituitary hormone and it's not those two, then it must be anterior pituitary. And here we see the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. And so we have these paraventricular nucleus here of the neurosecretory cells. And again, it's going to produce the hormone. It's going to transport it through this tract, and it gets stored in the posterior pituitary. And then when it's released, we have a capillary network here that will release it into the bloodstream. Now, oxytocin, during and after delivery of the baby, it affects the uterus and the breasts. It enhances smooth muscle contraction in the walls of the uterus. It also stimulates milk ejection from the mammary glands. That's different than prolactin. Prolactin, which is in the anterior pituitary, that stimulates the production of milk. Oxytocin stimulates milk ejection. ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. Now, what's a diuretic? Think about if a doctor prescribes a diuretic, it's a drug that makes you pee. Usually they give it to you if your blood pressure is high. If you pee, you lose some of that volume, that blood volume, and it helps to lower blood pressure. Okay, so that's why sometimes I think of ADH as, in just a sec, my pen, instead of ADH, I think of it as APH, the anti-P hormone. Okay? Although don't put that down on a test, that'll be wrong. So, but that's how I remember it, is the anti-P hormone, or antidiuretic hormone. So it decreases urine production by causing the kidneys to return more water to the blood. It also decreases water loss through sweating and constriction of arterioles, which increases blood pressure. And so with high blood osmotic pressure, this stimulates the hypothalamic osmoreceptors. So what the heck does that mean? Okay, high blood osmotic pressure. We have to think of osmosis. Now, in this case, what that means is you're dehydrated. You have less blood volume, so your blood's thicker, basically. So you're going to have more solutes than you do solvents. Okay? So since you have more solids than you do liquids, it's going to exert a higher osmotic pull. Okay? So that's what it means. High blood osmotic pressure just means your blood's a little bit thicker than it should be, so you're probably dehydrated. And so that's going to stimulate hypothalamic osmoreceptors, basically receptors that are monitoring your osmolarity, your blood osmolarity. And so the osmoreceptors activate the neurosecretory cells and synthesize and release the antidiuretic hormone. And the nerve impulses liberate the antidiuretic hormone from axon terminals in the posterior pituitary into the bloodstream. And it's going to go a number of places. One, to the kidney to retain more water, which decreases urine output. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the urinary system. And then target tissues would be like your sweat glands. So you have decreased water loss by perspiration from the skin, so you're not going to sweat as much and lose more of that water. If you're already dehydrated, you don't want to lose more water. And then the arterioles constrict, and that's going to increase blood pressure. So we can see this happening in a couple of different ways. One is if you're dehydrated, to hang on to that excess fluid, okay, or that fluids, I wouldn't say excess, but to hang on to the fluid because, well, you're already dehydrated, you don't want to lose more. But this is also in response to low blood pressure. So if you have low blood pressure, do you want to lose fluid? No. And so this is a way to help maintain or raise blood pressure. And so low blood osmotic pressure is going to inhibit hypothalamic osmoreceptors. And inhibition of osmoreceptors reduces or stops ADH secretion.